All right. What are the ways of acquiring possession? In short, what are the valid modes by which one can assert that he has acquired the rightful possession of the thing? Okay. There are three ways of acquiring possession. One is material occupation. Of course, the intent to possess must concur with the physical act of occupation. The second is subjecting the thing or right to the action of the person's will. And the third is the execution of proper acts and legal formalities like delivery of a public document. Okay. Subjection to the action of one's will. This is another mode of acquiring possession. This does not necessarily involve material occupation, but implicit from this is that there must exist a degree of control over the thing. Okay, like for example, delivery of a thing through tradition simbolica, delivery of keys, for example, or tradition lungamano, the mere pointing of things transferred. Like for example, there is a sale of goods stored in a warehouse. Okay, those are examples of delivery of possession, not only delivery of ownership. Okay, and those are illustrative examples of delivery of possession through subjecting the thing to the action of one's will. The third mode of acquiring possession is the execution of proper acts and legal formalities. Okay, this is actually the performance of juridical acts. Okay, which under the law, if performed, is equivalent to delivery of possession. Like when something is donated, okay, something is inherited, okay, or when one executes a contract, for example, involving a sale of a real property, and the sale is pursuant to a public document. We already know that the delivery of a public document is not only delivery of ownership, but it is also delivery of possession. Okay, execution of judgment, okay, and registration of public documents. These are some illustrative examples of acquisition of possession through proper acts and legal formalities. Okay, so we have this case, for example, instance, the case of Ignacio Wong versus Honorable Carpio. Okay, however, take note that in this case of Ignacio Wong versus Carpio Class, the execution of a public document as a form of delivery of possession was qualified. Okay, in this case, the Supreme Court ruled that if, however, notwithstanding the execution of the instrument, the purchaser could not have the enjoyment and material tenancy of the thing and make use of it herself because such tenancy and enjoyment are opposed by another. In other words, there is an adverse claimant, then delivery could not be said to have been effected. Okay, take note of that limitation to that rule that execution of public document is equivalent to delivery. Okay, we have this article 536. This is the acquisition of possession by one who acquired it and he employed force or intimidation for that purpose. according to Article 536 class, acquisition of possession by force or by intimidation is not a valid mode of acquiring possession. So the effect of which is that whenever the rightful possessor is, for instance, ousted from the property by force or intimidation, then it could not be said, or it could not be validly contended, that the illegal possessor has acquired possession which is entitled to protection by law. Because the consequence, if the possession is acquired by force or by intimidation, okay, the consequence, one of the salient consequences of that kind of acquisition of possession is that it does not affect or interrupt the rightful possession of the lawful possessor. Okay. Also in Article 537 class, acts which are merely tolerated, or those acts which are done clandestinely or without the knowledge of the possessor of the thing, or again, acquiring possession by violence, they do not affect possession. When we say, or when the law says they do not affect possession, the law is effectively saying that they do not interrupt the rightful possession of the lawful possessor. Okay. We have this rule well entrenched by jurisprudence class, that possession by tolerance cannot be a foundation for a claim of ownership. Miller Electric versus IAC is only one of the several cases decided by the Supreme Court explaining this principle. Okay. This case of spouses Lubrera versus Fernandez, one could not claim lawful possession, or if there is no basis to claim lawful possession class, and then one continues to possess the property, but he cannot explain what is the legal basis of his possession of the subject property, then possession is just by mere tolerance. And remember the effect of possession by tolerance. When you are a possessor by mere tolerance, it carries with it the implied obligation on your part to surrender possession whenever the rightful possessor would ask you to surrender possession of the premises. This case of spouses Makasait versus spouses. Okay. We already explained this in relation to Article 448 on good faith possession. And by way of just a review of what the Supreme Court ruled in this case, Supreme Court ruled that whenever there is an invitation, okay, it's not a case of possession by tolerance. That's why in the case of Makasait, since the son and his wife were invited by the father to build their house, then according to the Supreme Court, that's not a case of possession by tolerance, which made the Supreme Court rule that they were builders in good faith and thus entitled to claim the privileges accorded to them as such under Article 448. Now, holder of a torrents title is entitled to the possession of the land, which which is covered by the torrents system. Okay, that's why we have this rule that if the registration court, the land registration court, would declare one as the owner in fee simple, that declaration of ownership carries with it impliedly a declaration that the registrant, the successful registrant, is also the rightful possessor. That's why to recover possession, the registrant need not file an independent action to recover possession. What he may do is simply to file a motion in the cadastral court for the issuance of a motion for the issuance of writ. Okay. Same principle in this case of Villa versus heirs of Altabas. This case of Gardner versus Court of Appeals is simply a reiteration of the principle that when one buys from the registered owner, he did not look behind the certificate of title as a rule. Okay, although he is bound by the liens and encumbrances annotated thereon. Okay, this has something to do with possession in good faith or in bad faith. However, there is a principle that neutralizes, I would say, the harsh effect of the constructive notice rule in the torrent system of land registration. Okay, and this is actually, or this principle actually makes sense. Very simply, it says actual knowledge is equivalent to registration. One could not just close his eyes to whatever possible sources of defects that there may be with regard to his title, just because those defects are not recorded in the title. So if he chose to disregard those defects, or he failed to exercise the necessary prudence to inquire as to the nature of the title of his transferor, just because in the certificate of title there is nothing therein which would indicate that there are liens or encumbrances on the property, okay, this guy could not just invoke the principle that he merely relied within the four corners of the title. Okay. This case of Philippine Bank of the Philippine Islands versus Sanchez. This is a 2014 case. Please take note of the rules to follow whenever one deals with property covered by a torrent certificate of title. Okay. So the first rule, of course, is that all persons dealing with property covered by a torrent certificate of title are not required to go beyond what appears on the face of the title. However, there is an exception to this rule. Okay, and the exception arises where the purchaser or the mortgagee has actual knowledge of a defect or lack of title in the vendor, or he was aware of facts to induce a reasonably prudent man to inquire into the status of the property. Okay, that's an exception to that one that I earlier mentioned, the seemingly harsh rule in constructive notice. Okay. And so therefore, if one buys property with full knowledge of the flaws or defects in the title of the vendor, okay, that is in itself sufficient proof of his bad faith. Okay. Okay. To prove good faith, these are the following conditions that must be present. First, the seller is the registered owner. Okay. Second, the owner is in possession, and at the time of the sale, the buyer was not aware of any claim or interest of some other person in the property. All these conditions must be present. Otherwise, the buyer is under obligation to exercise extraordinary diligence by scrutinizing the certificate of title.